Okay, so you can let him back in because he doesn't know what we're doing.
Okay, just quickly after class, Matt is going to say a few words, and then we're going to give him a couple of gifts. Yeah. Okay, Judy, you can still hear it.
Okay, perfect. I got
That was funny.
I'm waiting for something. Is something going to be thrown at me?
No, not yet.
Okay, maybe later.
Bring out the tomatoes.
Yeah. I didn't realize they made football jerseys in vomit color.
Oh.
Hey-o, hey-o.
Wait, I didn't see any silver one.
Oh, hey now. There's a couple of you who love me on that one. Come on. All right. I think I can get started. Do I have permission for my class to teach my class now?
Yes.
Okay.
Vinnie says you may teach.
Vinnie said, yeah. Can a Vinnie in the room and say I teach? Lord, thank you for today. Thank you that we could gather and continue learning about your word and how to apply your word today. So, help us get through this and glean as much as we can to take us into the future and learn. In the name of Jesus, we pray this. Amen. Is this thing pretty hot? It sounds like it's peaking. If someone who knows what to do on a dial, Shelby, you want to do that for me? Sure. Thanks. That's why I get paid the big bucks. So we had a 4-week class on the 4 steps on how to study the Bible. Step 1, week 1, was you're looking at observations. Remember, we're just going in and saying, what does the text say? I'm not trying to figure out what it means. I'm not trying to figure out how to apply it. I just want to know what is it saying? And so you're just observing at that point. The next step we took was what? If you guys remember, what's step 2? What does it mean? And so you're taking some of the basic information and questions you ask, and then you try to figure out what does that mean in light of what it says, what's going on there. And what we're not doing is importing our own meaning. We're not saying, well, this is what I think it means. We're not saying this is how I apply it. We don't care about that stuff yet. It matters, but just not yet. So order of operations matter. So we spent week 2 and then part of last week discussing that. We talked about how there's tools that we can have that help us discover the meaning of a text. And what we really are going after is saying, when John or Paul or Amos or Moses or whoever wrote something, what was he trying to communicate to his audience? And that's what we want to understand. We want to be able to understand it in a way where if they were in this class teaching right now, this is the way they would explain it. The third step is we say, okay, in light of this, where is Jesus in the text? And whether that's an Old Testament text, a New Testament text, where do we find Jesus? We talked about the biblical story and how the story is about redemptive history. Remember how we talked about the biblical story is set in 4 parts. Creation. And what's part 2? Fall. Okay. And then what's step 3 or part 3? Redemption. And then part 4 would be what? Recreation. And so the bookends are creation and new creation. And that's Genesis 1 and 2, that's Revelation 22 or 21 and 22. But then you have the fall, Genesis 3, all the way through Revelation 20. So that's going on for a while. But unlike Americans and Westerners who like linear things where things start and stop, in an ancient way of thinking, in an Eastern way of thinking, they're okay with overlapping. They're okay with things not always lining up. And so restoration happens in the midst of the fall. So both things are happening simultaneously. And so we talked about how those things work. So once you learn how to engage those skills and develop those skills when you're studying the Bible, the last step we get to is, well, how do I apply it? What do I do with this information? So step 4 needs to remain as step 4. You don't want to skip steps because if you have the wrong interpretation, you'll probably have the wrong application. And so today we'll talk about application and how do we use these steps to get to application and what might that mean. One thing that we'll do is I found this clip on Twitter a couple years ago now, and it was something that was happening. I don't know the context of it because it doesn't matter because it's serving the point for our class. But it was a Texas state legislature thing about elections I don't have a dog in this race either way, so I'm not being passive aggressive about whatever. I don't care. But this is just a really good example of eisegesis. Remember that term we use? What's eisegesis mean?
When you're inserting something in.
When you're reading a meaning into the text. What's the opposite of eisegesis? And so that's the thing we want to do. We want to excavate the text. We want to pull the meaning out. We don't want to read our own meaning in. This is a very good example of probably someone who's a well-meaning person. They probably have a good heart. I'm not judging their motive, but I'm judging their method. This is eisegesis. So let's look at this. See if it. I have to hit it again.
There's a wonderful scripture about the security of elections that I want to read, and that maybe some of us may have never heard before. It's 2 Peter 1:10. Brethren, give diligence to make your calling and election sure. For if ye do these things, ye shall never fall. I love that scripture because this is what our watchers do.
So this had something was going on in the Texas State Assembly with elections, and they felt like it wasn't being done appropriately. And so this had been circulating for a couple days on Twitter a few years ago. And then it was funny because I'm going to show the next clip on the right. There's a lady who's an attorney. She was involved somehow in this, whatever this thing is. And she retweeted her own response because she happened to be the person to speak next. And she's like, I happened to grow up doing like Awana and stuff when I was a kid, so I know this passage. And she used this as an opportunity to actually do some good correction.
My name's Emily Eby. I represent the Texas Civil Rights Project and myself, where I am a staff attorney. And with all due respect to the distinguished committee, I do believe St. Peter was referring to the election of the saints, not the election of Texas State Senators.
So she did a very good job of making sure that we're engaging in, she wasn't engaging in exegesis in the sense of she wasn't pulling out. She was saying, it's not that. And so while the first woman was probably well-meaning and whatnot, that's the wrong way to apply the Bible. Like, that's not what Peter's talking about. So anyway, I just think that's a funny clip to show. So we talked about these things. So let's get into what is the goal of studying and learning the meaning of the Bible, and that's to apply it. It's not just to learn it. So I'll start with a phrase that I've been saying for a while, and this might seem offensive, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying. It doesn't matter what it means to you. Like if you're in a Bible study, and find a gentle way to correct someone else if they say it. I'm just saying the thing. If one of you said this, I would find a gentle way of saying it differently. But if someone says, well, what this means to me, it doesn't matter what it means to you. You can make it mean whatever you want. Okay, and remember how 2 weeks ago we talked about song meanings, and we looked through a couple different songs and said, okay, what might be the meaning of these songs? And so, yeah, if you dance, if your first dance at your wedding was to the Police's I'll Be Watching You, like, great, that might be meaningful to you. It doesn't matter that Sting meant it as a song about being a stalker for an ex-lover. Make that to be whatever you want it to be, right? There's some things that it doesn't matter how you apply it. You can have your own meaning. It's different. If this is God speaking, you don't get to make it mean what you want it to mean. It doesn't matter what you want it to mean. That's how cults begin. Okay, so what it means to me. No, we don't even want to use that language. What we want to do is we want to figure out what does it mean, and then how do you apply that meaning. That's what we're going after. So take yourself out of the situation, which as Western Americans, we don't like that because we love to make it about me. It's Burger King, have it my way. So the next thing we want to say is let's ask the question of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, and the Christian interpreter. One thing that we would want to correct as well is interpretation is more than possession of the Spirit. Just because you have the Spirit of God doesn't make your interpretation valid. And this is something that I've heard people say a lot, not necessarily in this context, but it's something I've heard over the years. And I don't need commentary, I have the Holy Spirit. It makes it seem like we become infallible at something. We could just read something and we're some data processing where we could just read it and automatically spit out the correct answer. I would say this is a false, but unfortunately common view that we don't need anyone else, which is hilarious because right off the bat, what are you doing? You're reading your Bible in English. Who gave you this? Like scholars who have PhDs who know how to interpret ancient languages. and how to do translation. Right up, you can't even get to this without including some sort of helper. Okay, so it's not about you on, it's not you on an island with your volleyball named Wilson and you guys can just live alone. Like, it's more than that. So the Spirit's not going to also just do everything for you. That's not the way God has designed people. So, why would I say that? Because Jesus says that. Matthew 22. What does Jesus say? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. If you're just going to be downloading information, you don't need a mind. You don't need a heart either. Just like a robot doesn't have a heart or a mind. As intelligent as artificial things are, they still don't have a heart and a mind. They're just being programmed on how to respond to things. They still lack those things. So we need to remember that, hey, God still works with and through people in the same way that God worked with and through people in the Bible. Paul wasn't merely a stenographer taking down information and then just dictating it. How do I know that? Because he says things like, I, Paul, right? Like he's talking about himself. He talks about his own experiences. We see different types of personalities show up throughout the scriptures where God is using people. He's using literary features. If we were to do this over a 12-week class, we would spend the last 6 weeks talking about how to read genres of the Bible. And you interpret genres based on things that are unique to that genre. And we've talked about that. Why is it that we oftentimes do our devotionals in the Psalms and the Proverbs and not in Numbers or Leviticus? It's written differently, right? There's something that's happening there that affects your soul. And so, that's something that we just need to be aware of. Like, no, God uses different ways of communicating in different people. And he also uses different people in this age, not to communicate a new word, but to communicate the gospel. So as people who are used, hey, we want to think clearly. We want to reason soundly. We want to study diligently and faithfully. And we know this matters because there's reasons why you chose this church to attend and not other churches. There's something that attracted you, and I'm using that in a positive way, not being attractional, but there's something that attracted you here about the reverence of the Bible and the reverence of Jesus that makes you want to go to this church and maybe not another church. That's not the only reason. It's one of the reasons. Why is it? Because there's a way in which the culture here takes seriously the Bible with their minds. It's important, but you got to have the heart as well. So these are things just to think about, like pre-application type thoughts when we go in. We need to make sure that we understand as we mature. We don't want to underestimate maturation and that process. You don't just start on day one ready to go, and just like anything in life, you're learning a skill. You're growing in that skill. You're being cultivated. That's a term we've used a lot around here. And so we need to be aware. And there's probably many of you who can put yourself in the cage of being a young zealous person who probably should have been caged up for a while. You're in that stage where you need to be there for a while because you're just kind of obnoxious and you know everything. And this happens oftentimes when we learn about a new topic on anything in life. Let's take the Bible out of it. How many of you have unfriended or muted or been unfriended or muted on Facebook because you yourself or someone you know started going to CrossFit 10 years ago, or you became a vegan or something like that, and then you have to tell everyone about this thing that's all involved in your life and not everyone wants to know. It takes a while to chill out on certain things, right? And you do the same thing when it comes to our spiritual maturity. Oftentimes we need to grow in our humility, in our meekness, and that sort of thing. It's the idea of me going to seminary thinking, man, how much am I going to know when I get out of here? And I did learn a lot about how much student debt I took out of there. But what you also learn is how much you don't know, because you're like, wow, this pool is a lot bigger than I thought. This pool I'm swimming in is a lot bigger than I thought it was. Hopefully that should bring you humility, and you're not just going away with, oh, look at how much I know now. And that's what happens when we grow in something. You're maturing, and you realize, oh, I'm probably not the authority on something like this. So just things to be aware of. Be aware of how we mature, be aware of how we grow, and those sorts of things pre-application. So interpretation and meaning versus application. We're not talking about the same thing when we use these phrases. So interpretation and meaning are kind of on one side of the equation, whereas application is on the other side of the equation. They're different things. They're connected, but they're not the same thing. So first thing we need to remember, the passage means, what the author intended to communicate. I do not get to determine what the passage means. You don't get to determine what the passage means. There is only one meaning to every text. The text is to mean something. Sometimes a text is written in a way where they're presenting something and there's like maybe a secondary meaning, or maybe the meaning is beneath the text. Remember when we were looking at songs a couple of weeks ago, and we looked at the opening to Hamilton. It's just kind of meaning what it's meaning. It was just an exposition, just explaining kind of the life of Alexander Hamilton and introducing characters. We then looked at that barbershop quartet song that was a kind of a lament. Most of it means what it means. This is a guy who's struggling through life. He works really hard. It's just the grinds of life are wearing on him, but he envies that lucky old son who just gets to roll around heaven all day, right? And so it means what it means. There's some imagery, there's some metaphors, but it still means basically what it means. We then looked at the favorite song of the class, the Metallica song. And on the surface, what was it talking about? A boy going off to war, a soldier. But then we heard the composer, and what did he say the song's about? It's about football players, old football players who are just thrown out there and they get beat up and destroyed, and it doesn't matter the accolades they're given. Once they're done, okay, who's up next? There was a meaning beneath the meaning, and that was actually the true meaning. And maybe we get application if you're someone who had a career where you felt like you were just chewed up and spit out. That could be the application or the takeaway, but still the meaning was that secondary meaning. That's what James Hetfield intended to communicate when he wrote that song, okay? So that's what we need to remember. There's usually one meaning, even if it's a secondary meaning, even if it's not on the obvious, on the surface, there's that real meaning. And it means what it means to the original audience. We want to ask questions, especially when we're going to Bible stuff and saying, how would they have interpreted this passage? What would they have done with this text? How would they have heard it? And what are the roadblocks that get in our way from understanding that? So remember, this should hopefully be review stuff, things that we've talked about over the last few weeks, but we need to remind ourselves of it before we get into this next section, which is application. So application, when you're applying something, that is our response to the meaning of the inspired text. It's our response, what we do with it, how we apply it. So application isn't necessarily dogmatic. It's not necessarily transcultural, meaning it's for all cultures at all times. It's not necessarily uniform. Sometimes application can be for all people at all times. Sometimes it can be specific to a culture. So this is the difficult thing. And this is when conflicts will arise amongst Christian denominations. It's how do you apply this? What do you do with this? How are we interpreting this? Do we baptize babies, or do we baptize people who could profess their faith? And, we can't plant a church together if we don't have agreement on that. Because what are you going to do when you start making converts and the converts have kids? What do you do with that? So that becomes an interpretation and an application question. Okay? Who's right, who's wrong? They both can't be right. I don't think they can both be wrong. So one of them is probably right. So what convinces you in your study to want to maybe choose one perspective over the other? So these are just the things we keep in mind. So the application of a text, it might change from person to person, the situation to situation, or from culture to culture. The application. Notice how I didn't say the meaning of the text might change. See how it's very important that we define those terms differently. The meaning stays the same regardless if you're living in Babylon in 550 BC or if you're living in Brentwood in 2024 AD. The meaning is the same. How does the application change that? That might change if you're in Babylon in 550 BC versus Brentwood 2024 versus North Korea 2024. The application might be different in all three of those settings, but it means what it means. Okay, so that's why it gets back to, it doesn't matter what it means to you. See why we emphasize that? It doesn't matter what it means to you. It means what it means. So things to remember. So how to apply a meaning then? So this is really getting into the heart of step 4. We first ask if the passage, based on the meaning, is descriptive or prescriptive. These are two words that are very important to remember. Is something descriptive or prescriptive? So what does descriptive mean? Descriptive is when a passage describes what happened historically. Okay, so you see the root word in there. It's descriptive. It's describing something. If something is descriptive, then application can be drawn from the basic principle of the situation. Okay, so what's going on here? How do I apply based on the principle that's happening? So an example of something that would say there's a descriptive application in Joshua chapter 6, the walls of Jericho come tumbling down. God said, hey, here's my enemies, they're in the land, you need to go overtake them. And the way you're going to do that, even though you're a smaller army, you're going to go and march around the city, and then the walls are going to come tumbling down. And we need to have this so we can have VBS songs in 2,000 years from now. Flannel graph won't make sense without the song. So what's the application to this? Something happened here. It's true. There's an ethic here, but is the application descriptive or the next word prescriptive, which just tells you do this? Well, it's descriptive. It's describing something that happened in this event. It's not telling you how God's people are to deal with their enemies for all times and all places. Okay, so if it was prescriptive, you would say, okay, we find our enemy, and as a church, we just do a walk around the neighborhood, and then the building's going to fall, and that's the way God deals with it. No, that's not what's happening. But what is some application from a descriptive standpoint? What God asked them to do is ridiculous. So what did it take on behalf of the people in order to accomplish this?
It took having faith in God to do what he told them to do.
It took having faith. So what's a great application for this passage? Like, there's a faith application. Sometimes we think application is limited to, well, should I go to that college or not? Like, it's a very tangible thing. How often is the application something like reminding you of faith? That's application. Okay? Like, okay, so what is God asking me to do in this time, and how do I exercise faith in that? Just like Joshua and the people did. Like that's an application of that text, looking at it in a descriptive sort of way. Now, the other thing that we would look at is what we would call prescriptive. And once again, the way I remember this one is when a passage prescribes or commands an outcome for all people. Just like when a doctor gives you a prescription, he's saying, take this medicine so you can heal or get better. So if a passage, what is it doing when it's prescribing? It's saying, do this sort of thing. So if something is prescriptive, it's giving a direct principle to be obeyed for the people of God in all generations. You notice how I'm also saying for the people of God. We oftentimes take Bible application and say, this is what all people are to do at all times, which becomes a problem. Because why are we enforcing a Christian ethic on people who are not Christians? Not that it shouldn't be the ethic for all people, but what if you're just expecting non-Christians to live by a Christian ethic? That's just demanding moralism at that point, right? And so that's what, like, we first and foremost start with your own house, your own people. Like, this is for us. And you preach the gospel, and then in light of the gospel, you say, now we live like this. Once again, there's an order of operations where it just becomes moralism. It becomes that sort of just, hey, act good. We talked about this. The Golden Hills podcast is still going right now. It will go through a couple more weeks. And Summer and I talked about this actually on the episode that launched this past Friday, I believe. I get them confused because we don't do them in order. But I think we just talked about it. So you could even hear us pontificate on that a little bit more. So when is something prescriptive? Well, there's some obvious things that are prescriptive. Like Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments, don't murder, right? And you see this ethic carried out all throughout Scripture of not murdering. Okay, this is something for all God's people of all time. We would say it's for all people at all time as well, but specifically it's for God's people. We don't murder. And so that's like a very obvious one. We would also say a prescriptive application is the Great Commission in the end of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus says, go therefore, make disciples of all nations, so not just Jewish people. Israel's Messiah is not just for Israel, it's for the whole world. Of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And guess what? I'll be with you always, even to the end of the age. So here is a prescriptive application of Matthew 28. God's people are to make disciples, and we do this by teaching to observe God's law and to baptize them. Like, this is a prescriptive thing. Yeah, Vinnie.
Thanks, Vinnie. How do you make the decision to decide that that's prescriptive? Because if you write it as descriptive, you could say that, like, that command or that prescription is only for the 11 that he's talking to at that moment. So how do you make that decision?
Great question, and that's so this is something where we'll start playing this out a little bit. I'm like, well, how do you determine what's descriptive, what's prescriptive, right? Part of it is looking at how has the church understood this. This is also as much as we would want to say it's me, God, and the Bible. That's very much a post-Reformation, post-Enlightenment thinking. Like all I need is me, God, and the Bible. And I don't think that's even what was intended when Martin Luther would talk about something like the priesthood of all believers. He's not meaning that you get to decide what you want to do on your own all of a sudden. I don't get to determine these things. So part of it is how has the Christian community understood these texts throughout history? How has this been interpreted and received by the church? This is where, once again, especially in the Baptist tradition, we go way too far in wanting to separate ourselves in a Reformation view. And we get too anti-Catholic, where it's like, oh, they're all about tradition. We're just about me and God and the Bible. Well, no, like even the early reformers weren't about that. And what does Paul even say in Timothy? Like the church is the buttress of truth, right? Like he doesn't say the Bible is the buttress of truth. He also does speak highly about the Bible, but you can't have one without the other. The people of God don't exist on their own. Okay, so you need to remember, hey, how has the church looked at these things over history? Which is why we even accept something like an Apostles' Creed or a Nicene Creed. Like that, these are beliefs that the churches adhere to. This is Orthodox Christianity. And when I say the church, we're speaking of universal church in general. So how has the church understood something like a Matthew 28? Well, there's minority views that have said this is just for the apostles, but that doesn't really make sense because, okay, so the apostles are supposed to go out and do this sort of thing, make disciples. And so this disciples are supposed to die off in one generation then. How are they supposed to carry this on? Right? I mean, so I would argue just even within the text itself, it can't be a mere command just for the disciples because this is a short-lived venture.
How about John 17?
The high priestly prayer, which part of it?
That he was praying for those that would come because of his word. And so that wasn't just for the disciples. That was for all who would believe and come through his word.
And so this is where what we would want to do is, remember, when we're starting with a text, we want to say, okay, what's happening in the text? How are we observing it? Let's find the meaning at that and that sort of thing. And then you start expanding it out. Are there other teachings on this? Where else do we find this sort of concept in the New Testament, in the Bible, and how might that inform our application? Paul was not standing on the mountain when Jesus gave these words, but he's going out and doing these things. He's making disciples. We know that he was baptizing people. Okay, so he's doing the thing as well then. So even the internal evidence that we get when we do the Google Zoom and we zoom out, we know, oh, this is something that people were doing. Timothy was doing this. Barnabas was doing this. You have a lot of other people who aren't in this specific scene that are doing this sort of thing. Okay, Anthony?
I mentioned you about Paul because with First Thessalonians chapter 3 or 4, he also talks about the believers having a simple life. He's not extolling going out; he's extolling working with your hands, not being under submission to anybody, maintaining a simple life. So there's a tension with him.
Yeah, absolutely, which is a whole thing. Yeah, that's a whole thing. Yeah. But this question, though, of what is descriptive and what is prescriptive, this becomes the thing that really becomes the dividing line in terms of this is what separates Christian groups. Well, what is descriptive? What is prescriptive? And how do you roll those things out? All Christians agree that baptism is prescriptive. This is something that has to be done. So how do you do that? What's the mode of that? And so now you have many denominations that are solely defined based on their mode of baptism. Okay? So it's one of those things that people are trying to figure out. So determining application then, here's some steps that we could ask. And there's so much more than what we could talk about today in terms of figuring this out. So this is getting us just ways to think about it. But remember, first ask ourselves, what does the passage mean? And then how do I live out that meaning in my life? We don't ask what it means to me. Can't overemphasize that enough. So something like Deuteronomy 22. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, that you may not bring the guilt of blood upon your house if anyone should fall from it. So there's a weird cultural thing happening here, because I don't know about you, like anyone decided to go hang out on the roof of their house yesterday. Those tiles get hot. Yeah. And you ever just have to go up on the roof, you're like, I could do that, and you get up and you're like, and you're like, I'm not liking this at all. Because who does that for fun? Like, most of us don't do that for fun. What the heck is this talking about in the Torah?
Well, that's what they did used to do back in those days.
So there's a cultural
where
thing.
they lived.
Okay, there's a cultural thing because roofs would be flat. Okay, say it again.
They still do.
Okay, so you've hung out in the Middle East,
Yes.
Vinnie Charles. So why would they? So you have experience in the military over there. Where would you see this happening?
They all have flat roofs.
Why?
Usually in the evenings, that's where they would hang out. Yeah.
So it's cooler. You maybe get the breeze.
It's cooler, get the breeze. Yeah.
And you're hanging out on the roof.
Absolutely.
Okay. So there's a cultural thing doesn't apply to us culturally right off the bat. We also need to look at the biblical theology. Where is Deuteronomy going to be sitting in the biblical theology? Remember the redemptive history? Where's Deuteronomy? Is it in creation, fall, redemption, or new creation?
Fall.
So it's going to be in the fall. So just knowing where it's at in the timeline. Then specifically, why is Deuteronomy given? What does Deuteronomy mean? Second law. Deutero, second, nomos, law. It's the second giving of the law. So the law is the Torah. This is the covenant given for Israel, that this is the way they are to obey. So right off the bat, you have a covenantal thing happening, which once again, this is a theological thing that divides churches on how to interpret the covenants and how to apply the covenants. So another interpretation there, okay? What we would say though is like this is in our context at Golden Hills, we would understand the covenants as something. This specific covenant is the Mosaic covenant given between God and Israel. This is the law of the land. This is a theocracy that they're living in. And these are the laws that govern the land. The 10 Commandments are the law, the covenant. And then everything else you see from Exodus 21 on is going to be case law. So one of the 10 Commandments is don't murder. Well, how do you know if you've murdered or not? What does murder look like? What's the consequence for murder? 10 Commandments doesn't tell us that. Where do we find that? In case law. So guess what? If you're hanging out on the roof of your house and someone falls off and dies, that's on you. You murdered them. Okay? So how do we avoid not committing murder and the blood not being on your hands? You do a railing around your roof. Okay? And then if they fall off, that's not on you at that point. You see how I'm saying? And this is a way of loving your neighbor. You see how the laws aren't as easy to divide it up. This is all part of the thing. So this doesn't apply to us culturally. I would also say legally it doesn't apply to us because we're not living under the Torah. But this is a great principle in terms of how to not murder. So how can I apply this? And many of you have applied this in your context. Who has a pool? Who has a gate around your pool? That's an application of Deuteronomy 22:8. Yeah. Now, are you doing this because you're commanded to if you don't have a pool? You know, you were grandfathered in, you don't have a pool, or you have a pool and you don't have a gate. Are you breaking Torah? No, because Christians are not under Torah. So we're not under the law, but the law is applicable. Right? And that's a whole other class that we can't get into. So come back next week and you can hear about it then. Sorry, is that too soon? Sorry. So that's one way of saying, okay, how do you apply something that just might not be completely relevant to us in that sort of way? So what we want to remember is the Spirit doesn't change for our purposes or circumstances. We don't adjust the meaning to fit our purposes and feelings. We say, what is the meaning? And then what do we do with that meaning? And try to figure out just contextually how that works. Another thing that we want to look at is how do we determine descriptive and prescriptive? Because that last one is kind of an easy one to go. There's probably not going to be a ton of pushback. Maybe if you're in a place where you have a different view of covenants and maybe the role of the covenant, the Torah, and how that might apply to Christians today, that would be the point of disagreement. But that's a presuppositional thing. You're not going to argue the case law. You're going to say, okay, no, let's back it up to the Torah itself and ask that question. So that would be a broader question that we would ask. But what do we do, though, when descriptive and prescriptive is not always obvious and oftentimes resulting in significant theological disputes amongst Christians? Okay, and like other ones can be, it's a dispute. But what do you do in something like a 1 Corinthians 14? As in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches. For they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. If there is anything, if there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it's shameful for a woman to speak at church. Yeah. So, guess what? We're not going to exegete the whole thing now, but here's some questions we could ask when we're doing observations. If we've read up to 1 Corinthians 14, what other passages are we assuming we've read? Like 11, 12, and 13? Okay, because that's the preceding passages. What are chapters 11, 12, and 13 about? What's the overall topic of those 3 chapters? Spiritual gifts. Okay, we know 13 because half y'all had it read at your weddings, the love passage. Love is faith. And that's not about love, it's about spiritual gifts and how to practice spiritual gifts. Once again, taking something out of context. What does 11 talk about? That talks about head coverings with women, right? What is the question in that passage? If they should wear head coverings while doing what? Prophesying and what? Praying in the Christian congregation. Like this is something they are doing in order to prophesy and pray. What's the most beneficial way of doing that? Out loud. So you're speaking in church. So Paul starts talking about spiritual gifts by talking about prophesying and praying in the congregation. And then he goes on in chapters 12 and 13 to continue talking about spiritual gifts for the church. And so this is something that men and women are involved in. They have spiritual gifts and they're exercising these things in the congregation. And then he tells us in chapter 14, the women should keep silent in the churches. They're not permitted to speak. Well, he can't mean literally what he's saying, because then they can't do the things that he just talked about in the previous 3 chapters. So if all we have is this one fortune cookie of a Bible verse, it means this. But Paul is contradicting himself if this happens, and along with other places in which Paul describes women being involved in things. So it can't mean this in this way that we're reading. It has to mean something else. Well, that's another class for another time. We should figure out what that means, and there's going to be different perspectives we're going to come down to. But in and of itself, it can't mean literally just this in these couple verses, or else Paul's contradicting himself. Okay, and so it's letting Paul speak for himself, and then once again, you Google Earth it. You go out and you say, okay, what other information can we gather here to figure out the meaning of this passage? So we're not going to exegete this passage right now. You're left to be a little uncomfortable. Women, I give you permission to ask questions. You don't have to go home and ask your husbands, if that's your conscience. But are there any questions without going into the text itself? Because remember, we're talking about the concept of how to apply and how to determine application, not what does this particular one mean, right?
Vinnie, I would just highlight exactly what you're saying. Like sometimes we can know what it doesn't say, and
that helps.
Exactly what it is saying. So that's where we can have unification. Like, okay, this does not mean this for sure. What does it mean positively? Sometimes we have to hold that fairly loosely.
And so there's multiple things Brian said there. That's great wisdom. Sometimes to figure out what something is, you have to define what it's not. Okay, and that's a way of and just like when you're diagnosing anything, if you're figuring out an engine or a computer problem or whatever, you say, okay, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this. That's part of the observation and what does it mean stage. And then you use the term holding it loosely. How would you, I want to hear how you, what do you mean by that, Brian? Because I probably agree.
Sometimes we go to scripture and it's very clear what the commandment is and what God is saying. There's other verses, we might have 1 or 2 verses that are on a topic, so we don't have the full picture of exactly what he's talking about. The baptism of the dead. Right? What does that mean?
Yep.
We better hold that pretty loosely because that's, to my knowledge, that's the only verse in Scripture that deals with that.
Yep.
So that's where we have to have wisdom, that the Lord focuses on His Word of what's important to Him, and other things we just have to hold loosely.
Very, very well said. So holding it loosely means there's some things that you hold on tight to, and it's like, nope, it's going to mean this, and this is, you can't take it from me. Okay? What are those things? It's going to be different for everyone, but once again, look, how is the church defining things like this? Okay? Virgin birth, the monotheism, the deity of Christ, like Apostles' Creed type stuff. No, we hold on to that. And then there's other things that we're going to hold on to. We're going to hold on to, baptism matters. We could have disagreements with the Salvation Army. It's not just a thrift store. It's actually a denomination. I don't believe they practice baptism. Does anyone know that for sure? I thought they don't practice the sacraments. You guys, can anyone confirm that for me? Because I'm pretty sure that's what. like I would just if and I'm pretty sure that that's our belief. I would say I disagree with you. I think you're misapplying Scripture. It's not the same conversation I'd have with a Presbyterian friend, where we would maybe disagree on the mode or method. You're saying we shouldn't do this, and I disagree with that. Okay, that's something that I'm holding on tightly to that. There's other things that we're going to say. I would say that you hold loosely to this. Like I think it means this, and I can have a conviction. I'm pretty sure I know how to interpret this. Like I have a conviction on how to interpret 1 Corinthians 11 and what it means for head coverings and women and that sort of thing. Like I think I know what it means. That's a very difficult passage. I would say I would argue it a certain way. I also hold it loosely enough to say if someone else had a different perspective, I'd be like, yeah, I can see how you get there. Okay, but I hold my perspective. Maybe you'll even change my perspective. It doesn't mean you have to be wishy-washy on everything. But what are the things that we hold loosely and say, this is where I'm at, and I might have maybe my hands are balled up a little bit more, a little bit less. But you can have that. But there's many things that we should be okay with in terms of saying, hey, but I get why you're at where you're at. We don't have to deny fellowship over this. Okay, that's an application thing. Yeah. Number 5. Our posture, because everything we just talked about goes into this thing, our posture towards difficult and disputed passages. So ultimately, at the end of the day, this is where I believe we need to live at when it comes to one of those that there's disagreement on. First, we determine, can a passage have different interpretations? Or can it only mean this? So you ask questions like, is it a matter of orthodoxy? So we would read something like a Psalm 82 under the understanding of monotheism. And if I were to teach a class on this, we'd probably go deeper and explore a lot more nuance, but we're just taking this one at a just kind of surface level. Psalm 82, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. I say, this is God saying, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. Well, if I'm LDS, how do I interpret this passage? You guys know?
You become a god.
You become a god. There's many gods out there. Okay. Well, in historic Christianity, it's monotheism. There's only one God who exists. Can that be the meaning of the text? Well, no. There's not valid multiple interpretations of if the big word is ontologically. By nature, multiple deities exist. There's only one true deity that exists. And if you were in the Trinity class, you could go back to remember some of those sorts of things. So this is a matter of orthodoxy. The meaning cannot mean that there's polytheism in that way. But if there's room for different perspectives or different nuance, that's when we do something else. We learn if the passage has faithful Christians who hold to various interpretations. We say, hey, how do you understand this? How do you understand this? And we evaluate our own position and why we hold to it. Why do I believe what I believe? Have I ever considered anything else? Am I just been handed off something? Do I have a conviction about something? Maybe you have a conviction and you want to refine your conviction. And these are all good things to do. When we want to explore different options, though, and say, okay, I'm seeing different sort of things. Where do I start? How do I get grounded in a topic maybe that has different understandings? So this would be my opinion. Start with your own tradition. So if I'm doing a study on Romans or Ephesians or something like that that's going to deal with predestination or election topics, this is where I would say, okay, if you want to do a deep dive on that topic, what ideas and where could you go to explore different thoughts? You just don't want to read the same thing over again. So, hey, what do people in, for Golden Hills, what do people in the Reformed tradition and specifically the Baptist tradition, how do they understand those sorts of things? I'm going to find those sorts of scholars and theologians and read them to start off to get a baseline of where I'm at. And, what do I do after that? Well, explore some of the other viable options that exist. So like in this year when we did Ephesians in men's Bible study, like there's a lot of election stuff that's being taught, predestination stuff in chapter 1. So I have the normal people that I read, but I don't want to just read the people who I know I'm going to agree with. So there's a couple scholars who are in my camp that I read, and I'm also going to read a Wesleyan scholar who's going to have, in Wesleyan theology, there's a much different idea of how to understand election and predestination. I want to get that perspective from the best minds on that topic. And then I also read a couple different perspectives on these sorts of things. So as I'm going through Ephesians, not just in chapter 1, but through all of Ephesians, I was reading like 4 different commentaries by different types of perspectives. And I'm doing that to make sure that I'm getting different kinds of thoughts. Who's someone and I'm going to use terms that you may or may not be familiar with. What's a reformed way of understanding Paul and Ephesians? I'm going to read that. What's a Wesleyan perspective on how to read Paul? Maybe in a more Arminian perspective. I'm going to read that. What's a new perspective on Paul and reading Ephesians? I'm going to read that. I'm getting different insights into these sorts of things for myself, just to say, okay, what's going on here? And I'm learning from all of these different type of things. For some of us, that can be daunting or overwhelming, or you might not know where to start. So you might not want to jump in full blast. But those are the types of things that you might want to do to explore different thoughts. In the same way, if you want to study end time stuff and you grew up in, I'll use a big word, in a dispensational way of thinking, well, if you're like, man, I really want to study end time, so I've always had the Riri Study Bible, and so I really want to explore more. So now I'm going to read Schaeffer's Systematic Theology, and then I'm going to read, I'm trying to recall different people in different camps, and I'm going to read Left Behind, and I'm going to read The Late Great Planet Earth. I'm going to read all these different views on end times and see what I come up with. They all have the same view. Like maybe some nuances in terms of how they might find some things different, but they're all basically functioning in the same world. So if you want to learn a different perspective, you actually have to leave that camp and read another Christian perspective. So this is something that you want to look at as well. What are the presuppositions behind the other conclusions? Presuppositions meaning, what do they believe? What are their core theological beliefs? If I want to read and learn about baptism, I'm not just going to read Baptist theologians. I want to read how a Baptist, a Presbyterian, a Lutheran, and a Roman Catholic all view baptism, because those are 4 distinct perspectives, okay? Like even infant baptism is not just infant baptism. Those are going to be done in different sort of ways and for different reasons. So I want to read, what are the differences between Presbyterian infant baptism and Lutheran infant baptism? How is that different from Roman Catholic infant baptism? They're different perspectives, okay? So that's figuring out what are their presuppositions, and then that's going to inform how they actually write and how they argue their points when they're exegeting a text. You guys follow me on this so far in terms of, it's probably something where you're like, okay, that makes sense. I would know to do that, but sometimes we need to be reminded of it. Yeah, John.
I was just going to say to kick it up maybe even another notch, it would be to find commentaries that actually interact with other positions.
Yes.
And so whether they're working with the original text or, because at the end of the day, right, everybody's in a different camp. The high-end scholars all know what all the other people believe, and so there's good reasons why they hold to it. And so the interaction I find to be helpful, or it could be published like a peer-reviewed theological journal on a particular topic, and they're interacting. And sometimes you'll see this kind of multiple kind of authors kind of having a dialogue through theological journals, or like the 3, 4, or 5 different perspectives on a particular,
that's very good.
Particular topic, right? Those books are pretty.
Are you familiar with that? There's books like 2 perspectives on something or 5 views on something. Are you guys familiar with that series? I don't think he has involved in those. That's a different perspective, actually, when the word's used in different ways. But like Zondervan has these where they have 5 views on. Actually, if you took. How many of you guys took the politics class that we did? I know a number of you did. One of the weeks we did a thing on 5 views on Christians involved in politics. Okay, and so and what this does is this gets 5 different scholars arguing from different Christian traditions on how Christians ought to engage in the public square. So it started from one end of the spectrum, like a separatist view, Mennonites, Amish, like that kind of view, where they're completely separatists. You don't get involved in any kind of way. And you read their chapter and you're like, oh man, this makes a lot of sense. I think I need to be Mennonite, right? I need to be Anabaptist, I need to be something like that. And then usually in these books, the other participating scholars will write quick rebuttals to why they don't, the critiques of that sort of thing. And you read that and you're like, oh yeah, that guy's right. Oh, this guy's right. And then you get to the next view. And so this 5 perspectives goes from all the way to complete separatist non-involvement to complete inclusion in terms of it's the duty of the Christian to be involved in secular government. And so you read these and you see, oh, I understand why they're coming from their perspective. You could disagree with them, but you at least is gaining information. So John has a great comment on that. And then good commentaries, they're always going to be footnoting the other commentaries. Yeah, Matt.
Are there any like guardrails where you would say, yes, you do all this reading and studying, but there is a limit or there's a line that everyone on this side of the equation, it wouldn't even be helpful to read that stuff?
That's a great question, and that just depends on the topic, and it depends on why you're. So it's a lot of depends. Older folks will love this. So if you have an issue with this, email philhill@northernhills.org. So yes, we're going there. So it depends on the topic. Like, what is the topic that I'm studying? It depends on where you're at personally in your own spiritual maturity. It depends on what can you actually handle. Sometimes these things can be overwhelming, and then you get what's called analysis paralysis because you just have so much information you don't know what to do with it. So those are some cautions, and just whatever. Also, are you doing this by yourself? One of the most damaging things you can do is just be the person who's watching YouTube videos by yourself all day, and you come to your perspective, and then you argue with yourself, and you have those fake arguments. Are you doing this within community? And it's very important, I think, to do that. You can't underestimate the damage that doing things by yourself will do. Do it within community. Are you in a small group? Are you having these conversations with your small group leader or a pastor or a mentor in some kind of way? Don't just do it yourself. Once again, if you've heard anything from me, especially today, it's not just you, God, and the Bible. You're meant to be in community. Yeah, so great question, Matt. So part of this is, okay, do alternate perspectives use sound reasoning? Does it seem legit? And sometimes we just might not know because we don't know what we don't know. Can I articulate the other positions as best I can? There's nothing worse than saying, oh, this person believes this. And then that other person standing in the room is like, no, I don't. And then you just came off as this authority. Can you describe and understand a position well enough that the other person would say, yeah, that's what I believe? You're not giving in and you're not conceding it. But I always want to be able to argue a different position as best I can to where if someone who held that view was sitting next to me, they say, yeah, that is what I believe. And the more I understand that view, the more I can engage in it in a meaningful way. Okay? And that's just important in everything in life. That's what we do with our spouses or kids or coworkers or neighbors. Figure out what's going on with them. What do they believe? Why are they holding this? Sit with them in it. And then from there, you have a launching point of engaging in the idea. Once you figure all this stuff out, then you just compare it and contrast it with your position. Okay, I held this. I've done all the study. Now I'm going to revisit it. Do I hold my original thought? What's going on with that? And this is something that you might do multiple times in life, even on the same topic. It's not like you say, okay, I've solved this problem, next. Like I've done this on multiple things where I'll revisit something a number of years later and say, okay, am I still here? In light of maybe growth I've had personally or more information I've been able to learn from, do I still believe that? And I think that's just an important thing to do, is to never have that arrogance or that hubris that says, like, I figured it out, I know it all. Because you probably haven't. Our posture as well. Love, charity, and honesty. So be loving. And especially, remember, this is the context of disputed and difficult passages. Why are we loving? Because we love God because he first loved us. So we don't start the love cycle. And so we should engage his word from a place of receiving and giving love. It's reciprocal in that kind of way. Also, Jesus' disciples are known by their love that we have for one another, so don't devour one another when disagreeing. That defeats the purpose. It doesn't matter how theologically correct you are if you could proudly ride with the license plate frame that says jerks for Jesus. Okay? I mean, we've never put that purposely on there, but that's what many people do. We also show charity when engaging with other views. So we don't what's called straw man. It's the fallacy that says you just kind of create this view that's easily knocked down. It's not a real view and that sort of thing. If you want an example of straw man, just start engaging in the political cycle of 2024, and you'll see it every time one pundit talks about what the others believe. They do it 100% of the time. They never accurately represent what the other believes. That's what a straw man is. We do the same thing oftentimes with theology. So try to understand the best aspects of other positions. We want to be intellectually and emotionally honest with our positions. So what we're seeking after is truth, not just self-affirmation. You're not just trying to prove that what you believed was right. go after what is true. We don't take the mindset of an apologist, meaning not apologizing for something, but someone who's defending something. So that goes along with sometimes we study something just to prove it's right. That goes into the term we used a couple weeks ago, being overly familiar with something, right? That's what we do when we have that kind of mindset. Apologetics are important, they matter, but we're trying to be faithful to the text and understand what the text means. So how do we do this? We're humble enough to even change our perspective to what is most faithful to Scripture. Always be faithful to the text. So don't let your emotional attachment to a position influence you. And that's going to be there. Don't think you're above that. And the greatest example is going back to a point that John was making. Scholars put things out in commentary form. And like I'll use this as an example. I do another podcast with a friend of mine who's a PhD, a New Testament scholar. He just finished a commentary on Revelation, and he got a bunch of people, like other big-time scholars, to read it, and they're going to critique it because it's put out in the public square once it's published, and they'll be engaging with this one. A couple weeks ago on our podcast, we interviewed an Old Testament scholar who wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation, and this guy, a high-end, Old Testament scholar, and there's so much Old Testament imagery in Revelation. He just published his commentary like a year ago. We're interviewing him, and Rob has a different perspective than this guy had on something. And in the middle of the podcast, this guy, Tremper Longman, was like, I think you've convinced me. I wish I could go back and redo that. This is, and this guy is like, he's like a top level scholar. He's not the only one that does it. Good scholars are open to always wanting to go after what is true. Okay? And this happens all of the time. That's why oftentimes updates to commentaries are written. Because the scholar has had new understandings and maybe has a different perspective on something. If the scholars, the people who are paid to write books, who have letters behind their names, who teach in institutions and are revered as on the Mount Rushmore of scholarship, if they're humble enough to say, my mind has been changed on this one. If they can do that, we can do that too, right? So it's all about that humility. Some of them don't do that, because there's a lot of arrogant scholars as well. But it's the ones that, I've got to meet a lot of them over the years, where it's like, man, you're even a better person than you seem. And that's why you do that sort of thing, because you're actually a humble person. So just avoid having those sorts of attachments to our beliefs on the things. Once again, we're talking about difficult and disputed passages. We're not talking about orthodoxy. We're talking about those things that are tough to understand. And like I've said, we also learn in community. Avoid being the one-man wolf pack. Don't be me and hours of YouTube videos. And there's endless hours of YouTube videos out there, so you can get sucked into this. Do this in community. So those are just our posture towards difficult passages. And then for many of us, we're involved in teaching, whether it's teaching a small group or maybe teaching a class, or maybe some of you will become formal teachers or pastors or whatever in life. Some of us most of us have some aspect of teaching and developing a lesson. And so what are some things that we can do to take all of this and apply it to that? Whether it's the first 3 steps and or the last step. So just here's some things that I would encourage you as a bidding farewell to say, these are things that have helped me over the years that I've probably had to learn the hard way. First, don't worry about showing all your work. Math teachers want you to show your work. So I'm told. I wouldn't know that personally, because I just did not do well in math. But apparently you have to show your work. As a teacher, you studied for, to teach a 1-hour class, you might have studied for 15 hours that week. You read a lot. You read hundreds of pages. You read all the stuff. You want to show all the stuff that you just did out of excitement, out of justification for all the work you did. And so we oftentimes think that just because we learn something, then it has to make the outline. It has to make the talk. So going back to like week 2, background information. It's often just to help us get a grasp on the text. Sometimes that stuff will never make it into the teaching that you're doing, or the writing for a study guide or whatever it's going to be. Sometimes it just helps you inform how you're going to approach the thing. It doesn't need to be there. Not everything needs to be there. I would say probably at least 50% of what you studied won't make your teaching outline. Okay. And how many of you ever taught anything in this, whether it's in your vocation or anything, you probably know that you came in way more prepared than what you actually presented. Yeah, that's part of being formed as a teacher. And sometimes something will pop up. And cool, you have it ready to go. Not all the time. It's just there. So it takes practice, though, to learn what doesn't need to be included. And that's just the error you're going to make as a teacher in any context. I've made that. I probably still do it now. But I've gotten better, I think, over the years of just not including all the things that are there just because I read it. Develop your own voice and style as a teacher. So don't teach like someone else. Sound like you. Don't sound like me. Don't try to sound like Pastor Phil. Don't sound like Pastor Larry. Don't sound like Tim Keller. We're all encouraged and influenced by others, but sound like you. You are you. Okay? And so glean from others, but you don't need to teach like they would teach, because that oftentimes just comes out weird. And we've either done that ourselves. I've done that myself, where I'm trying to just teach like someone else, or we've heard someone try to teach like someone else, and it's just awkward. Be you. What are the gifts that you're given, and teach like you, and just always do that. And sometimes it takes a long time to find your voice on how to do it. But this is like anything in life. If you played Little League, what did you do when you got up to bat? Whoever your favorite baseball player is, that's how your batting stance was, right? And we do this in everything. As a drummer, I lost so many gigs because I tried to play drums like my heroes, who I couldn't play like my heroes. And everyone's like, why are you playing? Like, dude, just shut up and play. Like, you can't do all the stuff that they do. Just play like you, teach like you, glean from them, but use the gifts that you have and the personality you have and be that way. It will take time to develop this. If you're not someone who regularly tells jokes, don't force jokes. If you're someone who has too much ADD going on and too many jokes, stifle your jokes. You should hear the things that don't make the but definitely challenge yourself to grow as a communicator. If you're a fast talker, slow down. Seriously though, I've even gotten slower. You might not believe it. Like I work on it. I try to get slower. If you're monodynamic, learn to increase your pacing. Be you, but then learn to develop as a communicator. Because you just don't say, this is just the way I am. No, you're communicating to someone. So you want to communicate in the best way. Let the text inform your teaching. Don't force an idea. So once again, can't say it enough. Always be faithful to the text. Eisegesis is a real issue. We talked about that. So avoid just reading things into the text. Be aware of your hobby horses. So that's that topic that you just can't get out of wanting to talk about, wanting to bring everything back to. I remember 11 years ago, I was looking for new churches, and I visited a church that I thought I might like. And they were doing a study on Ephesians 1. I didn't learn anything on Ephesians 1 except for a deep theological teaching on predestination. And so I talked to a friend about this, and this friend I found out used to go to this church 20 years earlier, and I'm like, yeah, that's all they talked about. He's like, they're still talking about that? Because for this church, like, that's a hobby horse thing in Reformed theology. They can't get past that idea. And some churches have that with end times or whatever. Like, be faithful to the text. Just don't force your hobby horse into what you're trying to teach, whether this is from a sermon or a small group or whatever that's going to be. This one I can't overemphasize enough. Don't merely teach to your personal learning style. There are multiple learning styles out there. And oftentimes what happens is the one we're most comfortable with, that's the one that we use to teach. So if you're someone who's just auditory, you can hear it and that's what makes sense to you, you retain it. You might have an aversion to slides or visuals or things like that. What do you do with someone like me who, if I hear something, it's gone through the sieve? Okay. I need to have visuals and I need to see it, or I just do not retain a thing. So try to become aware of the different styles of learning. What's visual, auditory, kinesthetic, reading and writing, intrapersonal, interpersonal, logical, and analytical. In your context, try to include as many of those as possible. They don't all work for every context, but be aware of those things and don't say that this is just because the way I learn, that's the way everyone else learns. And that's a real thing. And you're going to exclude people who, especially if you're the auditory learner who can just hear it, so you're just going to teach it, you're excluding a lot of people who don't function in that sort of way. Okay, let's do this for a few minutes. And unless there's any questions on just blurbs, and I gave you all that stuff in the outline, so you don't have anything there? Okay. We had a homework assignment to go through John 2 and use all the 4 steps as best we can to come up with a little teaching and application on this passage. So we want to observe what's in the text, discover the text, what it means, in its context, where is Jesus, and determine how we might apply that to our own lives. So we won't be able to do a full one now, and hopefully you guys did some of this on your own, so we'll just go through it quickly and glean some ideas and say, what are ways we could apply this? So I'm just going to go through and read it, and maybe we could stop if you see something or hear something. We don't want to observe everything because we could spend all week here making observations on 12 passages. But let's just kind of comb through it and do it in a really quick kind of Reader's Digest sort of way. So maybe like a sentence at a time. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee. So just real quickly to remind ourselves, what are some questions we'd ask, and what are some things that we would look up and try to determine?
Third day of what?
Third day of what? Anyone discover anything, especially in the context of John, reading from chapters 1 to this point, what are some questions we might ask about days? You guys pick up anything?
Like the third day Jesus rose again?
No, it's actually starting at, if you open your Bibles, look at John 1, like 19 through 28. So I should turn to John and not Acts. Do we see anything about days? Okay, so good. So we have a marker right there on the third day, or where was that? What verse were we at? I lost it. It's 29. There was the next day. There was one before that in 19 through 28. Verse 29. The next day Jesus saw. The next day he saw Jesus coming towards him. Verse 35, the next day John was standing. Right? You have a lot of days and next days happening. So there's some sort of sequence that John's already playing with. But it's interesting because here it says on the third day. So what are some options? Is he thinking back to that third day he had already referenced? Maybe. That's an option. Is a good commentary is probably going to let us know that it could mean on the third day or after the third day. So this is an interpretive issue. So we're trying to figure out what that means. So we're not going to solve this now because it's not relevant necessarily to the meaning of the text. I think this is putting us somewhere, though, probably towards the next Sabbath. So I'll explain that in a second. So there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee. So Jesus is from Galilee. This is north of Jerusalem. Cana is probably north of Galilee. So there's a wedding up there. What happens at weddings in the ancient world? What do we know about weddings? This is actually significant to understand. Wine. What else? Days long, probably 7 days long. So a multiple day feast. Who's invited to a wedding? It doesn't say it was his cousin or anything like that. Why would he come to this wedding?
Isn't it basically like the whole town, village, whatever?
If you have a party and the wedding is going to be one of the biggest parties you have, you invite everyone. And who's actually most important to want to try to invite? Think about it. How often does a little kid invites, it's Marsha Brady inviting Davy Jones to her birthday or whatever. Did I get that right? I'm okay. So you want important people, you want significant people to come to your things. So who are the significant people going to be in this context? Religious leaders, rabbis, teachers, rich people, landowners. It's those kind of people that you want to make sure to go there. Jesus is getting a reputation as a rabbi. So I want him at this. So we don't know why he's at this party, at this wedding, but it's because he's significant, probably. The mother of Jesus was there, so Mary's here. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me?" That's a context thing. Is that how we should read that? No. I like that way of reading it. So right off that woman, that's not a good way of, this is the ancient way of saying ma'am. So it's not as harsh and abrasive as we're going to read it because we're importing our own context. But it's still, I still think it reads a lot better when you do it my way. Hey, ma'am, what does this have to do with me? Why would he ask that? He's not the guy responsible. He's not the wedding planner. And they would have the wedding planners, basically. We'll meet him in a little bit. You would have someone who's responsible for hosting the event, overseeing it, and wine is the thing you got to make sure you have enough of. And this wedding planner guy, his job is actually to maintain this, make sure all the stuff isn't going out in day one. He's crowd control. He's making sure everyone's not getting drunk. So you're limiting. He's the governor in a sense, like on a golf cart. You have a governor. You all know this because if you ever go golfing, you want to try to go fast and do dumb stuff. But there's a governor on the golf cart. It slows you down. This sort of thing is happening here. So his mother said to the servant, sorry, what does that have to do with me? My hour has not come yet. What does that mean? What hour? Well, if we were to read through the rest of the Gospel of John, what is the significant hour in this?
When he shows who he is.
Ultimately, he shows who he is on the cross. That's the hour of his glorification. Okay, so my hour has not come yet, which means if I start doing stuff right now, that starts the clock. People are going to start knowing what's happening. Okay, so he that's probably what he's alluding to. But his mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Good mom there. Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification. Why does it matter that they're stone water jars? So let's say this: if you have to carry water in something. Hydro flasks were a couple years from being invented. So they didn't have those. Is a stone jar the best way to transport water? It's heavy. It's super heavy, right? And the women are the ones who are doing this. Say it again?
I think they're 30 gallons.
They're probably 20 to 30 gallons. Each one of those, they're significant in size. Anthony?
In Jewish antiquity, stone jars were hard to come by, but they're usually associated with the wealthy, so the purest form of a container. If you had basically a spun one, it's going to be porous, it's not going to be as pure.
So pottery is what you would normally use, but that's the average person's going to have that. Stone is going to be an expensive thing. It's also, it was there for the, what do we call it? Rites of purification. Being holy in Second Temple Judaism was about being pure. It's about being clean. And so you're cleansing yourself. And if you've ever visited different religions, I remember going to, I took a comparative religion class in college. You had to visit a institution not your own. So I went to a Hindu temple in Livermore. And so before you go into the temple, you literally have to wash I had to remove my socks and shoes, and I literally had to wash. That was their way of doing it. So I did that to be respectful. It's very similar in Judaism, where you have to be ritually clean. Well, in Judaism, porous pottery is not viewed as a clean object that can hold water. If water goes in there, it becomes impure. Wood would be viewed the same way, but stone would be viewed as something that can hold pure water. It could be contained as holy. So the jars were there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. And this is like 150, 180 gallons of water potentially that is going to be here. So Jesus said, fill the jars with water, and they filled them to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some and take some out to the master of the feast. So the master of the feast isn't the husband, it's that wedding planner guy. Okay, it's his job to make sure. He should have had the wine. And to run out of wine, think about if you had a wedding or any kind of huge gala or event and you ran out of something, that becomes the thing that the wedding was known for. Okay, it's the black eye, and so this honor and shame society. Everyone's going to talk about this. This is turning into a huge deal. The guests don't know about this yet, but the women know. Maybe Mary was helping out. Maybe she was just part of staying in the quarters where women were at, which might have been by where the food was kept. Somehow she knows about this ahead of time, and they want to avoid this making its way out to the main ball area, we could call it. So, take some to the master of the feast. So they took it, and when the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and he did not know where it came from, though the servant who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then poorly wine. You know, your sensitivities are lost a little bit, which is also the idea that Baptists especially love to propagate the idea that wine in the Bible was non-alcoholic, it was grape juice. They just had so much Welch's that now they're bringing out the bad Welch's because their senses are dulled by the good Welch's. No, that's not what's happening here. They go high shelf to low shelf. But he's basically dude, you brought out the high shelf stuff. They serve the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then the poor wine, but you have kept the good wine until now. So this is the kind of the end of the scene. And then John tells us, this is the first of his what? What does Matthew, Mark, and Luke use to describe great events that happened in Jesus' ministry?
Miracles.
John never uses miracles. He always uses signs. They're different words. This is not a translation thing. This is actually a difference in the word itself. what's the difference? A miracle is something miraculous. It's something that is amazing. It's outside of the ordinary. And it's usually demonstrating something. But a sign, even the word simono, it means to signify something. It's pointing to something else. The point wasn't that Jesus kept the party going. He's pointing to something else that's happening. And so it says, this is the first of his signs that Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory. And his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. So he was doing something to point to something else. What might that mean?
Pointing to who he is.
He's pointing to who he is. And so what do we already see in John? And we kind of hinted at this last week. How does the Gospel of John begin? In the beginning was the Word. So Genesis language, in the beginning, and it's talking about Jesus. All things were made through him, and without him there was nothing made that was made. This is creation language. And we start seeing this throughout. It's also interesting that the first big event that we see in John's Gospel has to do with a wedding. If we were to go back and read in the Old Testament, especially in the prophets, what kind of things do we hear in Isaiah and Amos about what the Messiah is going to do? He's going to come, and it's going to be like a wedding feast. Okay? So this is not merely that a wedding happened. It's describing exile is going to be ending. God's going to be doing his new thing, and through the Messiah. This is going to be Amos chapter 9, verse 13. Behold, the days are coming, declares Yahweh, when the plowman should overtake and reap, and the treader of grapes, him who sows the seed. The mountains shall drip sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow from it. You have numerous language in the prophets describing the vineyards and wine and that sort of thing. New wineskins. Rabbis in the first century would talk about, in the New Jerusalem or in the age to come, there is going to be wine, bushels of grapes. Is it a bushel of grape? I don't know. We got some vintners in here. Is it a bushel of grapes? That have 1,000 grapes. And each one of those grapes can be pulled out, and each one of those grapes can produce 1,000 glasses of wine. It's like that kind of hyperbole to talk about the significance of wine, and this is what the day of the Lord will bring. This is what the Messiah will bring. So what is Jesus saying? New creation language. It's also Old Testament prophet language about what God is going to do in new creation. And so how does he demonstrate this? He had creation right there. I'm turning water into wine. That's creation language. So he's calling on the Old Testament story. He's not doing something new. And guess what? The religious leaders couldn't do this. We shouldn't look to the religious leaders to do this. We should look to God to do something out of the ordinary that's pointing to something else. So that's a lot of the meaning of the text. Like, we didn't talk about anything else other than that's what it means. It's not just Jesus did a miracle to keep the party going. And he's not merely doing a miracle to prove that he's Messiah. He's not telling anyone he's the Messiah yet. That's not attached. It's a sign pointing to the bigger thing that is going to be happening. So, what do we do with that? How do you apply that? Like, in light of what it means what it means. How do you apply that?
Do what your mom says.
Do what your mom says. Very good. Said from a mom. Hey, wait, 1 Corinthians 14. Please don't speak in church. Ask Rick at home. This is the thing. It means what it means. Application, there could be different applications. So there's not one application. Some of them might be better applications than others. But the thing isn't go to a party and now make water into wine. This isn't prescriptive. It's descriptive of something.
Could he be pointing to the marriage supper of the Lamb?
So there's an application of the marriage supper of the Lamb. Ultimately, so we could even say, where is Jesus in the text? Okay, he's in the story. Ultimately, how does that play out in biblical theology? This is pointing to the ultimate wedding feast, where you're going to drink in the Garden of Eden of perfect fruit, and you'll never have to run out of wine. There will always be abundance of not only wine but perfect fruit that you can eat from. That also goes into the where is Jesus in the text. So how do you apply it? What are ways that we could apply that? There's multiple things, and there's smart people, well-seasoned people in here. You guys can come up with stuff. What do you think?
It's not my thought, though. So
okay.
But I once heard a rabbi teach that in Jewish traditions, there again, a groom would go to his hopeful bride's father and present wine as a request to marry his daughter. So to that woman's point, here is Jesus taking the water and creating wine, which in essence could be ushering in his marriage to what will be the the church. So he is technically beginning his ministry, even though he said his hour has not come. Now he's beginning.
Okay. What else? Keep going. Let's keep going with this. Especially for application stuff. How do we apply that?
It's like in the perspective of the servant.
Okay.
Because Jesus is like he's just beginning his ministry. I'm a servant. And the master of the house didn't have any wine. And then you ordered me to fill up 6 big jars of water. And then just draw it and serve water to the Toastmaster. Which is like, if that didn't turn into wine, I would be in trouble. But that servant had faith that Christ would turn water into wine.
That's good.
Something like that.
And I hadn't thought about the servant aspect of it as well, because even I came to serve, not to be served. And what are God's people called to do now? To continue to serve. So even as we help usher in a new creation, how do we do that? By means of service. Like there's an application point there, right? I hadn't even thought of it. That's great. Like there's multiple things. What are other things that might pop up here for application?
I might be off, but this makes me think about how Jesus says that he is the vine and
John 15.
We are branches. And so this is just making me think that, this is like a kind of little picture of that Jesus is the vine and the source of everything. And I don't know if the two are related, but that made me think of that.
And so there's so much more we could go on there. Jesus is I am the vine, you are the branches. He's using, once again, Old Testament language where Israel is the vineyard and God is the vine dresser. And so what do? The goal is to be blessed by being in the land. Guess what? I'm the vine, I'm the vineyard, you're the branches. And you could go out to all nations and be in the vine, in the vineyard, wherever you live. And so even there, how does that apply to us now? The wine is continuing to be served through the branches, and that happens in Brentwood. You don't need to go to the Holy Land and scoop up magic dirt.
But it's only Jesus.
But it's only through Jesus. Very good. Yeah. So there's even, how about looking at the people who are waiting on the religious leaders for this, for the rite of purification? They wanted a temporary purification. And they thought that's the way it was going to happen. And Jesus saying, no, there's a different way in which this is going to happen now. And even now, how do we look to religious leaders to do that, multiple types of things for us? When it's like, no, that's not what is happening here. Jesus might be doing a new thing here. But stop putting your faith in the institution of the stone jugs. Put your faith in Jesus, which is highly, I'm not saying like become saved. I'm saying, how does the church do that on a regular basis? Now, there's multiple ways that you can apply this and have different sort of application points, but it means what it means. You see what I'm saying? And so that's where we gotta sit in there and say, okay, what are all the different ways we could apply this? And that might change based on your perspective or your time. How does this look now, or compared to the church in China or wherever? The application might change, but the meaning stays the same. Okay. I mean, there's so much more we could spend on time with that, but let's see.
Vinnie,
Yes.
The meaning stays the same.
Yes.
Means that not only does it mean the same here in America, it means the same in China, it means the same in Africa, it means wherever you're going, that's...
The meaning, it doesn't matter if I'm teaching this at San Quentin or at Sunday school or in China at a house church or in Argentina or wherever. The first part stays the same. This is what it means. Yeah. That's what John intended to communicate. Now, how does it apply to the Christians in San Quentin or the saints at Golden Hills or the saints in China?
Cultures.
You have to contextualize.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So that's why application is a little more difficult, and you almost have to be creative in a positive way, not create your own thing, but saying, in light of what this means, what do I do with this? Yeah, great. Well, I mean, we could spend so much more time on that. We do have this, though, that I came up with. So.
That's all, folks.
I just went. Thanks. I just downloaded it. I didn't make it. What I did want to take a second, because I know they asked Matt to come up and pray at the end. A lot of you have asked like what's going on with me next, and so just to give a quick heads up, so then I can avoid like 55 emails. Right. So next steps for me. So this week is going to be the last week I'll finish out at church. Next week, I'll be gone for a couple weeks, so you're more than welcome to come to my house the next couple weeks to find me. We're going to be going to Portugal next week, so I'll be there for a couple weeks. Once I come back, starting in August, there's a couple different career things I'm trying out in the meantime. So I'm going to start substitute teaching again, hopefully shorter periods of time than longer periods of time. Yeah, that's a fun job. But I'll be doing that once the school year starts up. There's also 2 kind of career things that I'm trying right now. So it's a little bivocational. A couple years ago, it was on my birthday in 2021, I'm doing a motorcycle ride. And I'm thinking one day, I work at a church in the Bay Area. What are the odds I have a job in 10 years? Just thinking like, and what do I do as a guy in my late 40s, 50s? And so I actually started pursuing as a hobby, like what it means to do like commercial voiceover. And so the last couple of years I've been playing with that. So that's actually something that I'm going to be like pursuing, and I don't know if that will take off. I actually just finished an audiobook the other day, and you know what tell me this isn't ironic. You know what the book is about? The first book offer I get. It's called Midlife Mutiny. It's about what do you do in your midlife when you experience an uprooting and changes. And not making that joke up. No. You could buy it on Amazon in a couple months. But so I'll be doing different commercial voiceover things, trying that. And then also I have a friend who I've been doing some ministry stuff with for the last couple years, podcast and whatnot. He's a retired pastor, and he started a nonprofit a few years ago. He asked me, he said, hey, would you want to come in under my ministry and raise your own support and maybe do some stuff with me? And so that's something I'm going to be trying as well. And I'll be continuing to do a podcast with him and some other things that I'm going to be trying out, maybe like a weekly class over Zoom and things like that. He also, he teaches, or he mentors about 100 or so pastors in India. There's no Bible colleges over there, and they're very poor. So he meets with them multiple times a week and helps mentor them. And so he was like, hey, would you want to help the pastors in India? So that's another thing I'm going to be doing, providing free Bible college for them, basically. So if I'm going to send an email out this week just so you guys have my personal email and touch base that way. In kind of a shameful way to plug that. If you're interested in learning more about what I'm going to do with DetermineTruth Ministries, I did make a QR code that takes it to a landing page, just so you could see it, and then I'll email that as well. But those are some of the things that I'm going to be trying in the next year or so, and say how that works out. So yeah, so it's been an honor to serve you guys.
We wish you well.
That's been good. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So anyway, Matt, you talk.
Is it okay if I say a few things before I pray?
I don't know. Can you run it by me first?
What would be the fun of that? I was just thinking back of when we first met. I don't remember actually when it was, but it's had to be close to 10 years.
Oh, yeah.
And I've been a pastor for a while now. I've been to Bible school. I've been here at the church for many years. I've, like you guys, heard sermons, podcasts, done Bible studies, and I was thinking, if you lump all that together, all the learning and experience and training I've had, I think it would pale in comparison to what I've learned from you. I've had the joy of working basically next door to you the whole time you've been here, and I have taken full advantage of that, and you have availed yourself to me. So when I think of all that I know about the Bible, which is nothing compared to this man, I owe it to you. I owe it to you. You were patient with me, probably tongue-in-cheek a lot of times, like, are you a pastor? Or, how in the world did you get, right? But you didn't do that. You didn't hold that over my head. You taught me hours and hours and hours, and I think we can all agree, and maybe you hold that same conviction, that this man right here probably provided the bulk of your theological education and training, and he did it in a way that only Vinnie can. I also had the privilege of teaching with you, which was very scary. I could teach a lot of things, but teaching the Bible is very intimidating, especially to a room full of people, and you worked with me on that in this class. I was able to do this a couple of times with you, but I remember one Sunday, I don't know what the context was, but you weren't going to be there.
Okay.
Either you weren't going to be there at all, or you weren't going to be up here with me, because teaching is one thing, but having Vinnie on stage with you, man, that's okay. Because anything weird or anything I didn't know, it'd be like, that's this guy. How do I?
Vinny knows weird.
Yeah. But whatever was going on that day, you weren't going to be there, and I was freaking out. And you said exactly what you said about a half an hour ago. Just be you. You don't have to be me. You don't have to teach it like I do. You don't have to know what I know. Just be you. And I remember that, and I appreciate that. But it's not just the theology that I will cherish and remember. It's the friendship. It's and I think we can all have that experience with Vinnie. He's not just this guy up here that knows a lot about the Bible, but he's willing to get into our lives, even the difficult times of our lives. And if I think of the hours, hundreds, if not more, hours of lunches that we've had. By the way, if all these gifts you're getting, I'm expecting a real nice lunch.
I know. Tuesday we're gonna go somewhere good, right?
One quick story about the friend that this man is, and we know that Vinnie is got Raider in his DNA. He's got Kenny Stabler underwear, the whole thing.
He even has the beard on the underwear.
He's
the beard.
He invited me over to his house for the Super Bowl this year. And he was gracious. And when the 49ers had suffered that heartbreaking loss, as the true friend that Vinnie is, he suppressed his joy. Because I know that he wanted to shoot off bottle rockets and
It's like it's a
toast. The only thing better than your team winning is the team you hate losing.
Yes.
And sometimes that's even better
Yeah.
than your team not winning. But you didn't do that.
I
You
did not.
suppressed your joy. Anyway, I think we can all share in that as well, with Vinnie's friendship. His willingness to participate in our lives, go out to lunch with us, have coffee with us, be patient with us. So Vinnie, collectively, we just want to say thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge and sharing your heart with us and sharing your life with us.
Yes.
Let me pray. Father, I'm so excited for Vinnie. I'm a little depressed that he won't be here. And that's just a hard thing to think about. But I know that wherever he lands, wherever you've got for him, they're going to be blessed. They're going to be blessed above and beyond, because they're going to have this man to teach them. They're going to have this man to love them and shepherd them. These things that you've got on his plate right now, I pray that you would help Vinnie navigate his way through those different opportunities that he has, this vacation he's going to go on, and his teaching and all that stuff. I just pray that you would be the biggest part of that. You continue to just impart knowledge to him and then gift him to give it to others, because that's what he does so well. So God, as we say goodbye to Vinnie, in some ways, I know that we're still going to be friends and all that, but in some ways he won't be here, and that's sad. But just pray that we can be blessed and have joy at the thought of how you're going to use him in the future. So go before him in all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. I think you got some gifts coming.
Okay. Continues on their stuff.